Let yourself drift back, far, far back. We are letting go of the noise of the modern world, the constant hum of electricity, the glow of the screens. We are moving backward through the centuries, slipping past the industrial revolutions, floating past the rise and fall of empires until we settle gently, very gently, into the year 1000 AD. Now, imagine the North Atlantic Ocean. Today, when we look at a map, we usually think of these waters as a barrier. We see a gray, angry wall of freezing waves separating Europe from the Americas. But to the people of Scandinavia in the year 1000, to the Vikings, the ocean wasn't a wall at all. It was a highway. It was a road made of salt and spray that connected their whole world. A world of islands and fjords. But to understand the massive journey we are about to take, the voyage to Vinland, we first have to understand the weather. Sounds strange, I know. But if you were to stand on the western coast of Norway in this era, or on the black cliffs of Iceland, you would feel a wind that was, surprisingly, a little softer than you might expect. You see, the world was in the middle of a climatic anomaly. Scientists today call it the medieval warm period. Think of it like this. For several centuries, roughly between the years 900 and 1300, the North Atlantic took a deep, warm breath. The grip of the ice loosened. The average temperatures were warmer than they are today in those northern places. The massive pack ice, the ice that usually choked up the sailing lanes between Iceland and Greenland, it retreated. It opened up these beautiful sapphire blue corridors of open water. It was a window of opportunity. It was like nature gave them a silent permission slip, a green light to push their boats further west than anyone had dared to go before. It meant the summers were long and balmy. It meant the grass grew tall and thick, even right on the edge of the Arctic. But good weather alone doesn't make a family pack their entire lives into a wooden boat and sail into the unknown. People don't leave home just because the sun is shining. There was a pressure building, a push. Back in the homelands of Scandinavia, specifically in Norway, the world was changing. For generations, the Norse had lived as independent farmers, a rugged sort of people who answered to no one but their local chieftains. They were equals. But then came the kings. They began to tighten their grip. They demanded taxes. They demanded submission. And for the proud farmers of Norway, this was intolerable. They valued their autonomy above almost anything else. So, a great migration began. They looked west for freedom. First, they filled up the islands, the Shetlands, the Faroes, and then they moved on to Iceland. In the year 874, the first permanent settlers arrived in Iceland. They found a land of birch forests and volcanic fire. It was wild, and it was free. But humans, well, we are prolific. We grow. Within just 60 years, a single lifetime, really, the population of Iceland had swelled to nearly 70,000 people. Imagine that. 70,000 people crowding onto that island. The best valleys? Taken. The most fertile grazing lands for the sheep and cattle? Claimed. If you were a latecomer or a second son, you found yourself pushed to the edges. You were pushed to the marginal lands where the soil was thin and the wind was cruel. And so, the restless eyes turned west again. It was this hunger for land, this need for independence, that led a man named Eric the Red to go even further. Now, Eric was a man with a fiery temper, and he decided to colonize Greenland around the year 985. Now, we often chuckle at the name Greenland, don't we? We think it was a clever marketing trick by a desperate exile. And to be fair, Eric admitted it. He said he called it that because People would be much more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name. But here is the fascinating part. In the year 1000, under that medieval warm period sun, the name wasn't really a lie. The deep fjords of southwestern Greenland were lined with lush, emerald pastures during the summer. It really was green. Archaeologists have dug up Eric's own farm at Brattahlid, and they found a thriving estate with huge barns big enough to hold 40 cows. So picture this scene. It is summer in the eastern settlement of Greenland. The sun hangs high and refuses to set, bathing the landscape in a perpetual golden twilight. The air is crisp. It smells of crushed grass, peat smoke, and the salty tang of the fjord. It looks beautiful. It looks like a success, but it was fragile. You see, Greenland was missing the essential bones of life. It lacked the things you need to build a civilization. It had no timber. There were no forests here, just scrubby little bushes. You cannot build a roof beam from a willow bush. You certainly cannot build a ship from it. And it had almost no iron. They had to build their houses from sod and stone, to fix their ships, to build their homes. They had to rely on driftwood that floated all the way from Siberia. Or they had to wait for a ship to come all the way from Norway with a cargo of wood. And that was expensive. This is the world we are stepping into. It is a world of incredible resourcefulness, but also pressing scarcity. They are not sailing west just to see what's there. They are sailing because their ships are rotting, and they don't have the wood to fix them. They are looking for a hinterland. And in the year 1000, the settlement is buzzing with a rumor about a merchant who got lost in a fog and saw something incredible, a land of trees. This is where our journey truly begins. We are standing on the precipice of discovery. The warm sun is shining. The overcrowding is pushing them outward, and the need for wood is pulling them west. The ships are waiting in the harbor. Now let us step off the deck of that heaving ship and place our feet on the solid ground of the eastern settlement. It is important to understand where we are starting from to understand why we must leave. We are at the very edge of the known world. In a letter written centuries later, Greenland would be described as lying at the end of the world. And standing here, looking out at the icebergs drifting like silent, white cathedrals in the deep blue fjord, you can feel the truth of that statement. The eastern settlement, despite its name, is actually located on the southwestern tip of the great island. This is the heart of Norse Greenland. In the year 1000, it is a community of perhaps 400 or 500 souls. If you were to walk through the main settlement, the chieftain's estate, you would see that this is not a temporary camp. It is a fully functioning European society transplanted to the Arctic. You would see roughly built stone churches. You would see sheep and goats grazing on the hillsides. Their wool is destined to be spun into vadmal, a coarse, heavy cloth that serves as both currency and clothing. And you would smell the cows. The Norse are, at their core, farmers. They judge the quality of a land not just by its gold or ivory, but by the sweetness of its grass. Archaeologists excavating these farms have found the remains of large barns, or byres. At the chieftain's estate, the barn was large enough to hold livestock that were clearly the pride of the colony. But keeping cattle here, it requires an immense, almost desperate effort. The grazing season is short. For the long, dark winter months, these animals must be kept indoors, in the dark, fed on hay that has been painstakingly scythed and dried during the brief summer. But look closer at the houses. They are not the towering timber halls you might see back in Norway. They are built of sod and stone. hunkered down low against the wind. The roofs are covered in living grass. Inside, the walls might be paneled with driftwood, but the timber is scarce and precious. This This is the great vulnerability of the Greenland reality. The land is green, yes, but it is treeless. There are no forests here suitable for construction. The native birch and willow are scrubby, twisted bushes, barely high enough to reach a man's waist. You cannot build a roof beam from a willow bush, and you certainly cannot build a ship from it. To build a house or to repair the keel of a ship, a Greenlander has to rely on driftwood, logs that have floated all the way from the forests of Siberia, battered by the ocean for years before washing up on these rocky shores. Or they must wait for a ship from Norway or Iceland, bringing timber at great expense. And then there is the iron. If you were to visit the smithy at the settlement, you would see the smith working with a precious, dwindling supply of metal. Iron is the blood of the Viking Age. Without iron, you cannot rivet the planks of a ship together. Without iron, you cannot make the scythes to cut the hay to feed the cows that keep you alive through the winter. Greenland has no iron mines. There is bog iron, deposits of iron that accumulate in the wet peat of the marshes. But to extract it, you need intense heat. To get heat, you need charcoal. To get charcoal, you need wood. It is a vicious, resource-starved cycle. To make iron, you must burn the very timber you do not have. This scarcity creates a pressure that is almost physical. You can feel it in the way the men look at their ships. A ship in the year 1000 is not just a vehicle. It is a lifeline. But ships rot. Iron nails rust and snap. Planks crack in the frost. Every season, the ships of the Greenlanders are deteriorating, and they lack the materials to fix them properly. A report from a later century describes a Greenland ship arriving in Iceland that was sewn together with sinews because they had no iron nails left. Imagine that. Sailing the open ocean in a boat held together by thread because you ran out of metal. This is the context of our voyage. The Norse are not sailing west merely to see what is on the other side of the horizon. They are not driven solely by the lust for adventure, though that fire certainly burns in the blood of men like Leif Erikson. They are driven by economic survival. They are looking for the things that Greenland refuses to give them. They need timber to build their hulls and, more importantly, to build the ships that connect them to Europe. They need iron or the fuel to smelt it. And they need something else, something that defines the power of a chieftain: prestige goods. In the stratified society of the Norse, a chieftain like Leif must be able to offer gifts and hospitality to maintain his authority. Wine made from grapes is a symbol of immense status, usually imported at great cost from the Rhineland or France. If the rumors are true, if that merchant Bjarni Herjolfsson really saw a land of forests and perhaps even finer things to the west, then that land represents more than just territory. It represents the raw materials required to keep the Greenland colony alive. So, when Leif Erikson buys Bjarni's ship and gathers his crew of 35 men, he is not launching a colony in the modern sense. He is launching a resource-gathering expedition. He is looking for a hinterland, a place where the Greenlanders can go to harvest the wood and iron they so desperately need to survive on the edge of the ice. The ship is loaded with supplies. The wool sails are raised. The decision has been made. They will follow the ghost of Bjarni's accidental journey, hoping to turn a sailor's tall tale into hard timber and iron. The reality of Greenland has pushed them off the edge of the map and into the mist. The year is 986 AD. We are standing on a wooden dock at a place called Eyrar in southwestern Iceland. The air is filled with the sounds of a busy summer harbor. the bleating of sheep being loaded onto vessels, the rhythmic thud of axes repairing hulls, and the shouts of men moving barrels of dried fish. Among them stands a man named Bjarni. Now, Bjarni was a merchant captain. He was a man of routine, a man of pragmatism. He wasn't an explorer seeking glory. He wasn't looking to have his name carved into a runestone. He was just a man who wanted to see his dad. He had just arrived from Norway, his ship heavy with timber and trade goods, expecting to pass the winter on his father's farm, just as he had done every year of his life. But when he arrives, the farm is empty. The neighbors tell him the news. His father, Herjolf, has packed up everything. The livestock, the family, the servants. He has sailed west with a man named Eric to the new colony of Greenland. Bjarni stands on the deck of his ship, looking west toward the empty horizon, and he makes a decision that will, quite accidentally, change the course of human history. He turns to his crew and says, "Our voyage will appear foolhardy, since no one of us has entered the Greenland Sea, but driven by loyalty and the Norse custom of wintering with kin, he orders the anchor raised. He is going to follow his father. For the first 3 days, the voyage goes exactly according to plan. The wind is fair. It pushes their sturdy ship west, toward where they believe Greenland to be. But then, the North Atlantic turns on them. The fair wind dies. A thick, suffocating fog rolls in, erasing the horizon. The sagas call these the northern mists. And then comes the north wind, cold and biting. You must understand the terrifying nature of this predicament. In 986 AD, these sailors had no magnetic compass. They navigated by the sun, by the stars, by the flight of birds, and by the color of the water. When the sky is hidden by fog, and the sea is whipped into a frenzy, they are blind. For many days, we don't know exactly how many, but enough for the water casks to run low. They drift. They are tossed by the swells, having no idea where north, south, east, or west lies. Imagine lying in the hull of that ship, listening to the water hammering against the oak planks, the damp wool of your cloak offering very little warmth, just waiting for the gray curtain of the fog to lift. Finally, the wind shifts. The sun breaks through. Bjarni can finally take his bearings. They hoist the great square wool sail, which is now heavy with moisture, and they sail for a day. And then, a dark shape rises from the sea. Land. The crew is excited. They crowd the rail, staring at the coastline. But Bjarni shakes his head. He knows the descriptions of Greenland. He knows he is supposed to see huge glaciers, deep fjords, and high craggy mountains. This land before them, it is not that. It is not a land of ice. It is a land of small, rolling hills. It is lush, green, and alive. It is covered in forests. This is likely our first glimpse, the first European glimpse of the North American continent. Perhaps Newfoundland or Labrador. The crew, weary and thirsty, begs to land. They want to feel solid earth beneath their feet. They want to restock their wood and water. But Bjarni refuses. "You have no lack of either," he tells them. Now, that command surely caused some grumbling among the men. But you have to remember, Bjarni is a merchant with a cargo to deliver. He is not an adventurer. He is a delivery man who is late. He turns the prow of the ship north, leaving the land on their port side, the left side. They sail for 2 days. Again, land appears. It is flat and covered in heavy forests. Again, Bjarni says, "This is not Greenland." He refuses to stop. He is looking for the glaciers his father described. They sail for 3 more days, driven by a southwesterly wind. A third land appears. This one is high. It is mountainous, and it is topped with a glacier. It looks severe, inhospitable. The crew looks to Bjarni. He dismisses it immediately. He says, "This country looks worthless to me." They do not even lower the sail. They skirt the coast and realize it is just an island. Finally, after 4 more days of sailing before a stiff gale, they see a fourth land. It is a land of deep fjords and high ice. This, Bjarni says, is most like what I have been told about Greenland, and here we shall try to land. By a stroke of incredible fortune, or perhaps the keen instinct of a master mariner, Bjarni makes landfall at the very tip of the eastern settlement. He has found his father. Bjarni pulls his ship onto the beach, unloads his cargo, and settles down to farm. He gives up the sea. He never went back to find the wooded hills he saw in the mist. To him, the voyage was a failure because he got lost. But the story of the trees, that did not die. In the smoky longhouses of Greenland, during those long, dark winters where stories were the only entertainment, Bjarni told his tale. He was criticized for it. The saga says people found fault with him for his lack of curiosity, for bringing back so little information. He had found a new world and turned his back on it. But there was one man listening who did not criticize. He listened with the intensity of a predator. Leif Erikson. Leif saw what Bjarni had missed. Bjarni saw a navigational error. Leif saw opportunity. Leif saw timber for building ships and houses, resources that Greenland desperately lacked. About 15 years after Bjarni's accidental voyage, around the year 1000, Leif makes a move. He does not just ask Bjarni for directions. He goes to Bjarni and he buys his ship. Now, consider the significance of this purchase. In the Viking Age, a ship was often considered a living thing, something with a personality, a memory. Leif is not just buying a hull of oak and iron. He is buying the vessel that has already seen the new land. He is buying the luck of the ship that survived the fog and the storm. He believes, perhaps, that the wood of the hull remembers the way. Leif gathers a crew of 35 men. He is careful in his selection. He wants men who are strong, yes, but also men who can keep a secret and handle the unknown. He even asks his father, Eric, to lead the expedition, hoping to harness the old man's famous luck. But when Eric falls from his horse on the way to the ship, a terrible omen in Norse culture, Leif decides to command the voyage himself. We are now ready. We have the ship, Bjarni's sturdy, ocean-tested vessel. We have the map in our minds, Bjarni's route traced in reverse. And we have the motive. We need the wood. The wind is rising. The sails are unfurled. Leif stands at the steering oar, looking west, ready to turn a merchant's accidental detour into a purposeful voyage of discovery. To understand how these farmers and merchants could cross the volatile North Atlantic, we have to look closely at the machine that carried them. We have to strip away the popular image of the Viking ship and look at the engineering reality. Now, close your eyes for a second. When you picture a Viking ship, what do you see? You almost inevitably see the longship. You see the narrow, dragon-headed war galley, the kind designed for speed and terror. You see rows of shields along the side, and dozens of men rowing in perfect unison, surging toward a beach to raid a village. But if you were to stand on the dock in Greenland in the year 1000, Looking at Leif's ship, that is not what you would see. Leif did not sail a warship. He sailed a Nar. The difference, well, it's profound. Think of the longship as a greyhound, fast, lean, built for the sprint. The Nar? It was a workhorse. It was shorter, it was wider, and it sat much deeper in the water. It wasn't built for speed. It was built for volume. It was built for survival. These were stout, seaworthy vessels designed specifically to carry heavy cargo, livestock, timber, wool, and families across the open ocean. And here is a key difference. While a warship might rely on a massive crew of rowers, the Nar was powered almost entirely by the wind. It had a few oars, sure, but they were just for maneuvering in harbors. Out on the ocean, the wind did the work. Now, imagine walking up to the hull of this ship. If you were to run your hand along the side, you wouldn't feel a smooth surface. You would feel a series of ridges running the length of the vessel. This is the signature of clinker construction. Unlike the ships of later centuries, where the planks were set edge to edge to make a smooth skin, the Norse shipwrights overlapped their planks, just like the siding on a house. Now, you might think, isn't that primitive? But it wasn't. It was a sophisticated engineering solution. You see, they didn't saw the planks from a tree trunk. They rove them, which means they split the oak logs along the natural grain of the wood. This preserved the natural strength of the tree. By riveting these overlapping, grain-following planks together, the builders created a hull that was exceptionally strong. But crucially, it was flexible. That is the secret. A rigid ship fights the ocean waves. And if you fight the North Atlantic, eventually you break. But a clinker-built ship, it moves with the water. It breathes. When a heavy swell hits the side of a Nar, the hull actually twists slightly. It absorbs the energy of the wave rather than shattering against it. It snakes over the surface of the sea. The secret to holding this flexible shell together lay in the iron. At the archaeological site in Newfoundland L'Anse aux Meadows, the most telling artifacts they found weren't gold cups or swords. They were humble iron boat nails. These rivets were the tendons of the ship. Imagine the smith working. A nail was driven through the two overlapping oak planks. On the inside of the hull, a small, square metal plate called a rove, like a washer, was placed over the tip of the nail. Then, the smith would snip off the tip and hammer it flat over the rove, clenching the two planks together in a vice-like grip. But this reliance on iron created a perpetual problem. Iron rusts. Salt water gnaws at it. When the rust takes hold, the wood around the nail begins to rot, and the ship loses its integrity. That's why the crew had to be constantly vigilant, pulling out old, rusted nails and forging new ones. It was a constant battle against decay. Now, look down. At the very bottom of the hull lay the most critical component of all, the keel. This was a massive single timber, usually oak, running the entire length of the ship. It was the spine, but to secure the mast, the Norse used a massive block of wood known as the keelson. In Old Norse, they sometimes called it the kjeringa, which means the old woman. It's a strange name, isn't it? But the old woman had a heavy job. She was mounted directly over the keel. She had to hold the mast up and distribute the immense, terrifying strain of the wind-filled sail across the ship's frame. If the keelson failed, the mast would rip right through the bottom of the boat. And if the keel broke, well, that was the end. The sagas actually tell us of a later expedition where a ship was driven ashore in a storm, shattering the keel beneath it. They were stranded for a long time. When they finally fixed the ship, the captain raised the old, broken keel on a headland as a monument. He named the place Kshalarns, which means keelness. It was a stark reminder. In the open ocean, a broken keel meant death. Now, let's look inside the boat. We often imagine sailors having quarters, bunks, a galley. But inside the Nar, life was completely exposed. There were no lower decks. There were no cabins. The cargo, the timber, the cows, the barrels of milk was stored in the deep, open hold in the middle of the ship. The crew and the passengers, they lived on top of the cargo. They were open to the rain, the sleet, and the spray. When it was time to sleep, they didn't go downstairs. They simply unfurled a piece of gear called a fat. A fat is basically a sleeping bag made of leather or skin. They would crawl into these stiff leather bags, probably two men to a bag to share body warmth, and sleep right there on the deck. Just a layer of leather between them and the freezing wind. This vessel, this Nar, it was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. It was a vehicle that could flex with the violence of the Atlantic, could carry a whole community to a new world, and yet, it was light enough to be hauled ashore by its crew. It was held together by iron rivets, powered by the wind, and steered by a single side rudder. It was in this open, wooden shell that the crew placed their lives. They were trusting in the clinker planks and the old woman block to hold back the cold, dark ocean. And now, we must look up, to the engine that drives it. Let your mind drift upward now. Move your gaze from the damp, wooden deck of the Nar, past the mast, to the massive square shape that looms above you. It blocks out the sun. It is the heart of the ship. It is the engine that will drive Leif and his crew across the open ocean. It is the sail. Now, if you are imagining the white, snapping canvas of a modern sailboat, let that image dissolve. This sail is different. It looks different, feels different. It is organic. It is alive. It is made of wool. This is perhaps the most underestimated marvel of Viking engineering. We usually think of wool as something for sweaters or blankets. We think of it as something that gets heavy and soggy when it rains. So the idea of using it to catch the wind in the middle of a freezing ocean seems wrong. But the Norse shipwrights, they knew exactly what they were doing. To make a sail for a ship like Leif's, it required wool on an industrial scale. It would take the fleece of perhaps 2,000 sheep to create a single sail. 2,000. Just imagine that for a moment. Imagine the sheer investment of labor. It meant that for every ship that sailed out of the harbor, there was an army of women back in the settlements, in Greenland and Iceland, spinning miles of thread, day after day, through the long, dark winters. They didn't just shear the sheep like we do today. They rued them. That means they plucked the wool by hand when the sheep were naturally shedding in the spring. It was a tactile, intimate process. But here is the science of it. You see, the Norse had mastered the biology of their flock. They used the wool from the Vilsaw, the wild sheep of the north. These aren't your average barnyard sheep. They have a double coat. There is the tog, the long, coarse outer hair. It's tough and water repellent. And then there is the fell, the soft, insulating undercoat. When the weavers spun this together, they used the long, tough tog for the warp, the vertical threads, to give the sail incredible strength. And they used the soft fell for the weft. But even with the best wool, a raw sail would still rot in the salt air. It would soak up the spray and become so heavy it might capsize the ship. So the Norse performed a kind of alchemy. They treated the wool with a process called smoring. It sounds a bit like cooking, actually. They made a hot mixture. They took fur tar, they took red ochre, and they took animal fat. Sometimes it was beef tallow, sometimes horse fat. They would rub this hot, sticky red paste directly into the fabric. They forced it into the weave, and this is where the magic happens. They were using the sheep's own secret weapon, lanolin. Lanolin is the waxy oil that sheep produce to keep their coats dry in the rain. By adding the fats and the tar, they didn't just color the sail, they sealed it. They made it smooth, almost like leather. The water doesn't soak in, it beads up and rolls off. The wind cannot pass through the fibers, it gets caught. But the real genius of the wool sail is not just that it's waterproof, it's that it stretches. Imagine you are out on the Atlantic. A sudden, violent gust of wind slams into the ship. If you had a canvas sail like a modern ship, it is rigid. It snaps tight. That sudden shock transfers instantly to the mast and to the hull. In a bad storm, that shock can snap a mast in two. But a wool sail, it breathes. When that gust hits, the wool gives a little. It is elastic. It stretches, absorbing the shock of the wind, cushioning the blow before transferring the energy down into the ship. It acts like a shock absorber for the entire vessel. It is safer, so look up at it again. In the sagas, we often hear of red cloth. It is likely the sail was a deep, rusty red, colored by the ochre and the tar. It stands out stark and bold against the gray steel of the Atlantic sky. A massive, blood-red wing. Smells distinctive, too. If you were standing there, you would smell the pine tar, the damp wool, and the animal fat. It is a heavy, earthy scent. As Leif stands at the steering oar, he is not just trusting his life to the wood of the ship. He is trusting it to the wool. He is trusting the months of spinning done by the women back in the smoky halls of Brattahlid. He is trusting the chemistry of the fats. The ship surges forward. The wool sail grows taut and silent. It catches the invisible energy of the air, and the coast of Greenland begins to fade into the mist behind them. We are now truly at sea. As the coast of Greenland drops below the horizon behind us, we are left with nothing, just the heaving, slate-gray Atlantic. There are no landmarks here. There are no lighthouses blinking in the distance. And, perhaps most surprisingly to the modern mind, there are no compasses. In the year 1000, the magnetic compass was unknown to these sailors. They could not look down at a little needle swinging north to find their way. So, how did they do it? How did they find a speck of land in 1,000,000 square miles of moving water? They had to read the ocean and the sky. They had to read it with a literacy that we have largely lost. Their primary guide was the sun. But in the high latitudes of the North Atlantic, the sun is a fickle companion. It swings low along the horizon, and for days at a time, it can be hidden behind thick, impenetrable banks of fog. When the sun was visible, the Norse navigator used a simple, ingenious device known as a bearing dial or salskugfjall. Imagine a small wooden disc floating in a bowl of water to keep it level. In the center, there is a small pin. Now, before the voyage back on dry land, the navigator would have marked the path of the sun's shadow across that disk throughout the day. He would draw a curve, out at sea, as long as the shadow of the pin fell right on that carved line. He knew the ship was maintaining its latitude. He knew he wasn't drifting too far north or too far south. It was a brilliant application of geometry, turning a shadow into a road map. But what happened when the fog rolled in? When the sky turned a uniform milky white and the sun vanished completely? This This was the sailor's greatest fear, being blind. But recent history suggests the Vikings possessed a secret weapon, a stone. The sagas call it the Solarstein, the Sunstone. For a long time, people thought this was a myth, magic. But it wasn't magic, it was geology. The stone was likely a crystal called Icelandic spar. It is a clear, geometric crystal found in the rocks of Iceland. Now, if you hold this crystal in your hand, it looks just like a piece of clear glass. But it has a special property. If you were standing on the deck on a cloudy day, unable to tell where the sun was hiding, you would hold this crystal up to the gray sky. As you rotated it, the crystal would change color. It would suddenly darken or turn yellowish. You see, the crystal reacts to polarized light. Even when clouds block the sunlight still scatters through the atmosphere in invisible rings. The crystal can see those rings. By marking the angle where the stone changed color, a navigator could point a finger at a patch of gray cloud and say, "The sun is right there." It allowed them to see the invisible, while these instruments kept them on their main heading. The crew also watched the world around them. They looked for more organic signs. They looked to the birds. The North Atlantic is alive with traffic. And the Vikings, they were expert bird watchers. They paid very close attention to the puffin. Now, the puffin is a coastal bird. It does not wander endlessly over the deep ocean like an albatross. If you see a puffin, you know land is somewhere nearby. But the Norse read more than just presence. They read direction. They knew that a puffin flying with a beak full of fish is heading toward its burrow to feed its young. That means it is heading toward land. A puffin flying with an empty beak? It is heading out to sea to hunt. It was a simple binary code. Follow the fish. And then there was the water itself. We tend to think of the ocean as just blue, but it isn't. In the deep, abyssal ocean, the water is a dark, bruising indigo. It looks heavy, but as you approach a large landmass like Greenland or Baffin Island, the color shifts. The glaciers on the land grind up the bedrock into a fine powder called glacial flour. This powder washes into the sea, and it turns the water a milky turquoise color. A navigator standing at the bow, looking down, would see that shift from dark indigo to glacial blue and know, without a doubt, that land was rising up to meet them. And finally, at night, when the sun was gone and the birds were sleeping on the waves, they looked up. They looked for the Leidarstjarna. In Old Norse, lei means way or course, and stjarna means star, the guiding star. We call it Polaris or the North Star. To the Norse navigator, this point of light was the anchor of the universe. All the other stars dance. They rise and set. But the Leidarstjarna is steadfast. It sits almost motionless in the north. Leif knows that as long as he can see the star, he cannot be truly lost. By measuring how high the star sits above the horizon, perhaps using nothing more than the width of his hand, he can figure out how far north or south he is. So, guided by the shadow on a wooden disc, by the magic light in a crystal stone, and by the flight of a small bird with a beak full of fish, the Nar moves confidently westward. The mist begins to thin. The water changes color. We are getting close. But before we can spot those birds, before we can watch the water change color and feel the thrill of discovery, We have to go back to the very beginning. We have to go back to the dock. We are back at the edge of the fjord in Greenland. The year is approximately 1000 AD. We are standing on the shoreline of Eriksfjord at the estate of Brattahlid. The name Brattahlid means steep slope, and if you look behind the bustle of the harbor, you can see why. The land rises sharply, a ribbon of deep, verdant green pressed against the gray granite and the blue ice of the distant glaciers. The preparations are nearly complete. Leif has gathered his crew, 35 men. Now, look at them. These aren't just sailors. They are farmers, they are builders, they are fighters. They are strong arms and skilled hands, chosen because they can row, they can build a house, and if they have to, they can fight. The air is thick with noise. You hear the rolling of heavy barrels, the clatter of wood against wood, the low, rhythmic chanting of men hauling cargo. Let's look at what they are carrying, because to survive on the open ocean, and to live in a land where they don't know what grows, they have to bring their own world with them. They have to pack the concentrated energy of the Greenland summer into the hold of that ship. First, there is the fish. You would see stacks of it, stiff and flat as wooden shingles. This is stockfish. It is cod that has been gutted and hung on wooden racks to dry in the freezing, dry winds of the north. It is a marvel of food preservation. You see, the Norse didn't need salt to preserve this fish. The air did the work. It sucked the moisture out so thoroughly that bacteria simply couldn't grow. In this dried state, the fish is light, it is durable, and it is packed with protein. To eat it, well, the crew will have to beat it with a hammer and soak it in water. But right now, as they stack it into the ship, it smells faintly of the sea and old wood. It is the smell of survival. Then, there are the barrels, heavy oak casks, bound with iron. Inside, sloshing gently as the men heave them aboard, is skyr. This is the staple of the Norse diet. It's a cultured dairy product, kind of like a very thick, strained yogurt, though technically it's a soft cheese. In the cool climate of the north, and thanks to its natural acidity, skyr could be kept for months in these wooden casks without spoiling. It was the taste of home, sour, thick, and nourishing. Alongside the skyr, there would be kegs of whey. Now, we often think of whey as a waste product, the stuff you throw away when making cheese. But for the Vikings, it was essential. They used it as a preservative for meat, and on long voyages they drank it. Quenched your thirst, and it was much less likely to go bad than plain water. So the ship is getting heavy, but there is another kind of heaviness here, an emotional weight. You see, Leif had wanted his father to lead this expedition. Eric the Red, the founder of the colony. The man was a legend. He had immense luck. And in the Norse mind, luck was a real force. It was something a leader possessed, like strength or height. The crew had practically begged the old chieftain to take the helm. They believed that if Eric was on board, the sea would behave. And he agreed. Imagine the scene just hours before the departure. Eric, feeling the years in his joints, perhaps, but still proud, riding his horse down from the main hall toward the ship. He carries the weight of leadership. He is the patriarch. But then, the horse stumbles. Eric is thrown to the ground. He hits the dirt hard. He hurts his foot. A sharp, shocking pain that breaks the spell of invincibility. In the Norse worldview, this is not an accident. It is an omen. Eric lies on the ground, looking up at the sky, and he makes a pronouncement that seals the fate of the voyage. He says, It seems that I am not fated to find other lands than the one in which we are now living. We shall ride no farther together. He turns back. He limps back to the great hall, leaving Leaf to command alone. So now, standing by the ship, Leaf feels the mantle of leadership settle fully onto his own shoulders. The sagas describe him as a large, strong man, of very striking appearance and wise. He watches as the last of the supplies, the tools, the weapons, the sleeping bags made of skin, are stowed aboard the Nar. The ship itself is restless. It pulls at its moorings, the tide beginning to turn. The crew boards. They find their places among the cargo. There is no luxury here. They will sleep on the deck or on top of the barrels, wrapped in their sea gear, exposed to the stars and the freezing spray. The order is given. The mooring lines are cast off. The men push against the dock with long poles, guiding the heavy, clinker-built hull out into the deeper water of the fjord. The sail is unfurled, that great square of red woven wool we talked about. It catches the wind with a heavy thwump, the mast creaking under the sudden strain. As the ship begins to move, picking up speed, the figures on the shore grow smaller. The stone walls of the church shrink into the distance. The green pastures, the cows grazing near the water, the smoke rising from the longhouse fires, all of it begins to recede. They are leaving the known world. Behind them lies the fragile safety of Greenland, a colony clinging to the edge of the habitable world. Ahead of them lies the gray, heaving expanse of the Davis Strait. And beyond that, the lands Bjarni saw but did not touch. The sounds of the settlement fade away. They are replaced by the rhythmic wash of water against the hull and the wind singing in the rigging. Leaf stands at the steering oar, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. They are alone now, suspended between the ice of the north and the promise of the west. The voyage to Vinland has begun. We are now away from the comfort of the fjord, the green slopes of the farm, the smell of the hay. It has all vanished, swallowed up by the cold, gray mist behind us. We are entering the Davis Strait. To the Norse, this body of water wasn't just a crossing. It was a threshold. It was the volatile corridor connecting the Arctic to the Atlantic. Now, if you were to lean over the side of the ship, the gunwale, and look down past those salt-crusted oak planks, you would see a profound shift in the world beneath you. In the fjord, the water was a reflection of the land. It was dark, calm, contained. But here, in the open strait, the ocean breathes, and you would notice a striking battle of colors in the water. To the east, closer to the Greenland coast, the water is a deep, bruising indigo. It is the color of the abyss, heavy with salt and depth. But as the ship pushes westward, you begin to see streaks of a different hue, a shocking, almost milky turquoise. They call it glacial blue. It is fresh water, ancient ice that has melted and bled into the sea. And it carries something with it. Rock flour. Basically, the massive glaciers up north grind the bedrock into a fine powder, like flour. When that powder hits the water, it turns the sea into a swirling, marble pattern of blue and green. It creates a visual map of the currents. And Leaf, standing at the steering oar, he has to read that map without any instruments. He has to watch the way the indigo swirls into the turquoise to find the safe path. And then there are the shapes in the distance. We are entering Iceberg Alley. Now, the Norse were used to ice. They lived on the edge of it. But out here, in the middle of the strait, the ice takes on a monumental scale. These aren't just chunks of ice. These are tabular icebergs. They have calved from the great glaciers of the north, and they are drifting slowly southward. To a sailor in a low, wooden ship, these are not just obstacles. They are floating islands. They are indifferent, and they are unstoppable. And imagine the sound. In the silence of the open ocean, where the only noise is the wind in the wool sail and the creak of the mast, you hear a sudden, thunderous crack. Sounds like a cannon shot. Miles away, a piece of ice the size of a cathedral breaks off and crashes into the sea. The swell from that impact travels across the miles. It lifts the small Viking ship gently and then lowers it again. It is a reminder of the immense energies at play here. The air is different, too. It is sharper. It is cleaner. Carries a metallic tang. It is the breath of the Arctic. As the ship moves further west, leaving the warmer currents of Greenland and entering the colder embrace of the Canadian currents, the temperature drops. The moisture on the rigging begins to freeze. That grate will sail, heavy with lanolin and tar. It stiffens in the cold air. This crossing, it is a feat of trust. Leif and his crew are sailing off the map. They are moving from the high, familiar peaks of Greenland toward a land they have only heard described in a story told by a man who didn't even stop to look. They are navigating by the sun during the day, using those sun compasses to keep their line, and by the stars at night, specifically the pole star, which hangs high and unmoving above the masthead. But mostly, they are reading the water. They are watching for the change in the swell that indicates land is breaking the ocean's rhythm. They are watching for the flight of the birds, and they are watching the color of the sea, waiting for that deep, bottomless indigo to give way to the lighter greens that suggest the bottom is rising. As the days pass, 2, perhaps 3 days of open sailing, the tension on board changes. The open horizon, which has been their entire world, begins to break. A shadow appears in the west. It is not a cloud. It is hard, jagged, and permanent. They are approaching the first of the 3 lands described by Bjarni. The deep ocean swells begin to shorten and steepen. The color of the water shifts again, from the clarity of the open sea to a darker, sediment-rich gray. The air grows colder, if that is even possible. Ahead of them lies a coastline that looks nothing like the fertile promise of Vinland. It doesn't look like a place where grapes grow. It is a wall of rock and ice. It is a place where the glaciers grind directly into the sea. This is the land Bjarni saw but refused to name. But Leif will not make that mistake. He will go ashore. He will stand on this new continent, not for the timber, and not for the grapes, but to name it, to claim it with language. The ship slows. The sail is reefed. The men move to the oars, their breath steaming in the cold air. They are about to step onto the stone slabs of a new world. The ship slows. The heavy will sail, damp with the mist of the Davis Strait, luffs, flutters, and then falls silent against the mast. The crew can hear the water lapping against the clinker-built hull. It is a rhythmic, wooden sound, a sound that emphasizes the profound, heavy quiet of this place. We have arrived at the first of the new lands. Leif Erikson orders the anchor dropped. It splashes into the gray, icy water, pulling the rope taut. They lower a small boat, the afterboat, and row toward the shore. Now, imagine you are sitting in that small boat. You are rowing through the frigid shallows. The air feels thin, sharp in your lungs. As the wooden keel grinds against the beach, you step out. But you don't step onto sand. You don't step onto soil. You step onto stone. This is the land that the sagas call Helluland. In the saga of the Greenlanders, the description of this place is stark, unforgiving. It tells us that upon landing, Leif and his men looked around and saw no grass. Instead, they saw a landscape where the mountain tops were covered with glaciers, and from sea to mountain the country was like one slab of rock. If you look at a modern map, we know almost exactly where they are standing. This is the coast of Baffin Island, likely the Cumberland Peninsula. It is a place of, well, geological brutalism. The name Leif gives it, Helluland, comes from the Old Norse word Hella. It literally means a flat stone or a slab of rock. And the stones here are not small pebbles. The saga of Eric the Red gives us this fascinating, specific detail. It says they found flat stones, many and so great that two men might well lie on them stretched on their backs with heel to heel. Huge, monumental tables of granite and gneiss, scoured flat by thousands of years of ice. If you walk along those shores today, you see exactly what they described 1,000 years ago. It is a world of monochrome, gray stone, white ice, and black water. Looking inland, your eyes are drawn upward. Just as the saga says, the horizon is dominated by ice. The glaciers of the Penny Ice Cap still loom over the coast here, white tongues of ice winding down through the mountains, grinding the earth into dust. We have at least done better than Bjarni, Leif says, perhaps with a grim smile, for we have stepped ashore. But is it empty? Leif describes it as barren. He calls it a worthless country. But if you look closely, there is life here. The sagas mention that Arctic foxes were there in abundance. Imagine seeing one of them, a white ghost against the gray stone. In the summer, they might wear a coat of brown and gray to blend in. Small, solitary creatures scavenging along the shoreline. To a Norseman, who valued furs highly, these foxes would have been the only redeeming feature of this desolate rock. But recent archaeology has whispered something else to us, something the sagas barely hint at. For a long time, we thought the Vikings just stopped here, looked at the rocks, and left. But at a place called Tanfield Valley, right there on Baffin Island, researchers have found something startling. They found fragments of yarn. Now, to you and me, a bit of string doesn't sound like much. But this yarn was spun from the fur of the Arctic hare, using a technique that the indigenous people living there, the Dorset people, did not use. And alongside it, they found whetstones, stones used for sharpening metal tools. And on those stones, microscopic traces of bronze and brass. The indigenous people of the Arctic didn't smelt brass. These tiny, silent artifacts suggest a scene we can only imagine. Perhaps, on these flat stones, there was a meeting, a quiet exchange between the Norse sailors and the people of the ice, a sharpening of a knife, a trade of yarn for walrus ivory, before the ships moved on. But for Leif Erikson, standing on that beach in the year 1000, Helluland is a disappointment. Remember, he is a farmer. He is a builder. He looks at the massive flat stones, and he sees no timber for his ships. He looks at the glaciers, and he sees no pasture for his cows. He sees the foxes, but you cannot build a settlement on fur alone. I shall give this country a name, Leif says, and call it Helluland. It is a naming of dismissal. He acknowledges the land. He categorizes it by its hardness, and he prepares to leave. The crew returns to the Nar. The boots of the Norsemen crunch on the sterile rock one last time. They haul the anchor up, dripping with the cold mud of the bay. The great wool sail is unfurled once more, catching the northern wind. They turn the prow of the ship south. They are leaving the stone slabs and the glaciers behind. They are searching for the second land described by Bjarni Herjolfsson, the land of forests. As they sail, the air begins to grow slightly warmer. The gray of the rock begins to fade, giving way to the promise of green. We leave the gray, imposing desolation of the stone slab land behind us. The Nar catches the northerly wind, its red wool sail taut and full, pushing the vessel southward. The air begins to change. The biting, metallic sharpness of the high Arctic softens, replaced by a scent that the crew has not smelled in years, perhaps not since they left Norway. It is a scent of resin, of damp needles, of life. After 2 days of sailing across the open water, a new coastline rises from the sea. This land is flat. It lacks the jagged, glacial peaks we just left behind. But what takes the breath away from the men on board is not the shape of the land, but its color. It is a deep, dark, impenetrable green. Leaf steers the ship closer, and the crew crowds the rail, staring in silence. They are looking at trees, not the twisted, knee-high birch scrub of Greenland, but true forests. Forests that stretch from the water's edge back as far as the eye can see, rolling inland like a dark ocean. Leif gives this land a name that reflects its greatest treasure. He calls it Markland, forest land. To understand the emotional impact of this moment, you have to remember where these men come from. In Greenland, a piece of timber is a rare jewel. A beam large enough to support a roof must be imported from Europe at great cost, or salvaged from driftwood that has floated across the polar basin from Siberia, battered and waterlogged by years in the sea. But here, in Markland, which we now identify as the coast of Labrador, the wealth is staggering. The forest here is the boreal, dominated by the black spruce. If you were to step ashore and walk into that tree line, the ground would feel spongy beneath your feet, a thick carpet of moss and fallen needles. The black spruce is a survivor. It is a tree designed by evolution to withstand the crushing weight of snow and the bitterness of the subarctic winter. It is narrow, conical, with short, stiff needles that are blue-green and waxy. For the Norse shipbuilders, this forest is a warehouse of essential parts. The spruce provides long, straight poles for spars and masts. The wood is light, but strong, and rich in resin. When you cut into a black spruce, the sap is thick and sticky. To a Viking shipwright, that sticky resin is the smell of waterproofing. It is the chemistry of keeping the ocean out of the hull. They can boil the pitch to make tar, sealing the wool of the hull and the iron of the rivets against the salt spray. In a world of sod and stone, Markland represents an unlimited supply of the one material they cannot produce themselves. But as they sail further south along this wooded coast, the landscape offers another surprise, a feature so striking that it earned a mythical name in the sagas. The rocky shoreline gives way to sand. The saga of Eric the Red describes this coastline vividly. It speaks of long, sandy beaches, interminable stretches of white sand that seem to go on forever. The crew sails for days, watching this white ribbon separate the dark green of the spruce forest from the blue of the Atlantic. Because the wind was often light, and the sailing slow, and the beach so incredibly long, the Norse gave this place a poetic name, Furustrandir, or the Wonderstrands. These beaches are likely the strand flats near Cape Porcupine in southern Labrador. Geologically, They are a marvel, miles of unbroken sand deposited by ancient glacial rivers, washed clean by the Labrador Current. Imagine the contrast. You are standing on the deck of the Nar. To your left is the open Atlantic, rolling and gray. To your right is a wall of white sand, glowing in the sunlight, backed by the dense, brooding shadow of the spruce forest. The sound of the world has changed. In Helluland, there was only the wind and the cracking of ice. Here, there is the soft, rhythmic hissing of waves washing over sand, a sound of summer, of gentleness. The crew puts the small boat, the afterboat, into the water. They row ashore, the keel grounding softly in the sand. They step out onto the beach. It is likely they find self-sown wheat, probably limegrass, which grows in dunes and looks remarkably like grain. But their eyes are drawn to the trees. They touch the rough, flaky bark of the spruce. They test the weight of the driftwood logs that litter the high tide line, wood that hasn't traveled thousands of miles, but perhaps just a few miles down the coast. It is here, in Markland, that the economic logic of the voyage becomes undeniable. Even if they find nothing else, this land justifies the journey. We know from Icelandic annals written centuries later that ships continued to sail to Markland to harvest timber long after the Vinland settlement attempts had ended. A ship sailing from Greenland in 1347 was blown off course to Iceland, and it was returning from Markland with a cargo of timber. This forest was the lumberyard for the Greenland colony for nearly 400 years. But Leif does not stop here to build his home. The black spruce is useful, but the air is still crisp. The winter here will still be hard. He is looking for something more. He is looking for the land Bjarni described as having a mild climate, where the cattle would not freeze. They return to the ship, their boots covered in white sand, the smell of spruce resin on their hands. They haul the anchor. The wool sail is raised again. They leave the wonder strands behind, a white line fading into the distance, and point the prow of the ship south, toward the warmth. Let your attention settle now on the people. We have spoken of the wood and the wool, the sunstones and the currents, but a ship is nothing without its crew. Leif Erikson did not sail alone. The sagas tell us he gathered a crew of 35 men for this specific journey. 35 souls. Now, try to visualize them. Try to picture 35 grown men packed into the open hull of a 50-foot Nar. This is not a cruise. It is an exercise in extreme intimacy and endurance. There are no private cabins here. There are no below-deck quarters where a sailor might retreat for a moment of solitude. The entire world of the crew is confined to the open deck, exposed to the vast, gray dome of the Atlantic sky. Life on board is dictated by the rhythm of the watch. Space is so limited that the crew likely sleeps in shifts. And when it is time to rest, they do not go down into a warm bunk with a feather pillow. Instead, they unfurl a piece of gear known in Old Norse as a fat. A fat is, well, it's a sleeping bag, but it is made of skin or leather. In the saga accounts, we are told that when the crew eventually made landfall, they took their leather hammocks ashore to set up camp. But here on the ship, these leather bags are the only barrier between a sleeping man and the damp, cold timber of the deck. To conserve heat in the biting North Atlantic air, they likely sleep two to a bag. Imagine the sensation of crawling into that stiff leather casing. It smells of animal hide and oil. It is warm, borrowing the heat of your shipmate, creating a small cocoon of safety while the freezing spray hisses over the gunwales just a few feet away. When they are awake, The cold is a constant companion. The Norse dress in layers of heavy wool, tunics and trousers. As we discussed with the sail, wool is a miracle fiber. It retains heat even when it is wet. And on a voyage like this, you are never truly dry. The hygiene of the crew is defined by the salt spray. There are no fresh water showers. Fresh water is precious. It is stored in casks for drinking only. The men would smell of wood smoke from the last time they were ashore, of the pine tar used to seal the ship, and of unwashed, damp wool. And then, there is the food. There is no galley. There is no fire for cooking on the open ocean. A fire on a wooden ship pitching in the swells is a recipe for disaster. So, the diet is cold. It is hard. And it is purely functional. They eat hardtack. This is a flat, unleavened bread made of barley or rye. It is baked bone dry so it will not spoil. It is hard as a board. It requires strong teeth and a lot of patience to chew. They eat dried fish, that stockfish we loaded back in Greenland, torn into strips. But to survive the cold, to keep the body warm in sub-zero wind chills, they need fat. They need the dense, high-calorie energy that only blubber can provide. Archaeological evidence from Norse sites tells us that seal meat was a staple of their diet. On board, they likely eat it dried or cured. Perhaps they dip their hard bread into a bowl of seal oil to soften it, and to add that essential fuel for their bodies. It is a heavy, oily diet. It is not designed for pleasure. It is designed to keep the internal furnace burning against the chill of the Labrador Current. Day after day, this is their reality. 35 men, eating cold seal and hard bread, sleeping in leather bags, watching the horizon rise and fall. Rise and fall. They are wet, they are tired, and they are completely reliant on the wooden shell beneath their feet. Yet, there is a discipline here. They are not merely enduring. They are working. They are trimming the sail to catch every breath of wind. They are bailing the water that seeps into the bilge. They are watching the birds. They are waiting for the line of the forest to break the gray monotony of the sea. But the sea, well, the sea is not done with them yet. The rhythm of the voyage changes. For days, the Atlantic has been a vast, heaving lung, breathing slowly beneath the keel. But now, the breath quickens. The sky, which has been a pale, consistent gray, begins to bruise, turns a deep, violet black in the west. It is a color that seems to have weight, pressing down on the horizon until the line between the sea and the sky is erased entirely. You can feel the change in the Nar before you see it. The ship begins to feel restless. The gentle pitch and roll that lulled the crew to sleep in their leather fats becomes a sharper, more urgent motion. The wind, which had been a steady companion pushing them westward, begins to sing a higher note in the rigging. It is a whistling sound that vibrates through the wool of the sail and down into the mast. Leif Erikson, standing at the steering oar, watches the water. He knows what is coming. The North Atlantic is about to test the engineering of his ship. When the storm hits, it does not strike like a solid wall. It strikes as a great, chaotic churning. The waves, which had been long, rolling hills, steepen into jagged peaks. The wind strips the foam from their crests, sending streaks of white spume flying parallel to the water. Like smoke, to a modern observer, accustomed to the rigid steel hulls of ocean liners that smash through the waves, the behavior of this Viking ship would seem terrifyingly fragile. But this is where the genius of Norse engineering reveals itself. If this ship were built like a modern vessel, rigid, stiff, and unyielding, The violence of these cross swells would snap it in two. A rigid structure fights the ocean, and the ocean always wins. But the Norse shipwrights did not build a fortress. They built a basket. They built a living thing. Remember the construction we spoke of? The overlapping oak planks riveted together? There is a secret hidden inside the hull that you cannot see from the outside. A secret that allows the ship to survive this chaos. The planks of the hull are not nailed to the internal ribs of the ship. If they were nailed, the ship would be too stiff. Instead, they are lashed. During the construction in Greenland or Norway, the shipbuilders went into the forest and dug up the long, tough roots of the spruce tree. They stripped these roots of their bark and soaked them in water until they became pliable, like leather ropes. Archaeologists at Lance Aux Meadows found fragments of this very material, twisted spruce root rope, discarded in the bog. It is evidence of the vital maintenance required to keep these vessels alive. Inside the hull of Leif's ship, the planks are tied to the frames with these spruce roots. They act as ligaments. They are the tendons of the vessel. As a massive wave rises on the port quarter, lifting the stern and twisting the bow down into the trough, the ship does not crack, twists. If you were lying in the hold watching the hull, you would see the gunnels warp and flex. The ship literally snakes over the surface of the water, conforming to the shape of the wave rather than resisting it. It is a terrifying flexibility to witness, seeing the solid oak floorboards shift beneath your feet. But it is this elasticity that dissipates the crushing energy of the storm. The spruce roots stretch and groan, holding the skeleton of the ship together while allowing its skin to move. The noise is immense. It is a symphony of stress. The high-pitched creak of the spruce lashings, the deep groan of the keel, the thrumming of the wool sail which has been reefed down to a small patch of red cloth to keep the bow into the wind. The water crashes over the side, icy and heavy, and this brings us to the most exhausting reality of the storm. The water is not just outside the ship. It is coming inside. As the hull twists and flexes, the gaps between the planks, the lands, momentarily open and close. The caulking of tarred animal hair holds back most of it. But the ship weeps. Water seeps into the bilge constantly. There are no mechanical pumps here. There is only the Oscar, the bailer. It is a shallow wooden scoop. And during a storm, the bailing never stops. The crew takes turns. They stand in the icy slush at the bottom of the hull, rhythmically scooping the Atlantic Ocean out of their wooden home and throwing it back over the side. It is back-breaking, monotonous, freezing work. The survival of the ship depends not just on the spruce roots, but on the endurance of the men with the bailers. Yet, there is a strange calm at the center of this violence. The ship is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It rides high, cork-like. The flared hull deflects the worst of the waves, throwing the spray outward. Leif gripping the steering or is not fighting the sea. He is reading it. He steers the ship down the slopes of the waves at an angle, preventing the vessel from broaching, turning broadside, which would be fatal. They are wet. They are cold. The salt spray has crusted their beards and eyebrows with ice. But they are not lost. They are riding a piece of technology that has evolved over centuries specifically for this environment. They trust the oak. They trust the iron. And most of all, they trust the humble spruce roots that groan and stretch in the darkness, holding them in the palm of the ocean's hand. Slowly, the violet black of the sky begins to lighten to a bruised gray. The wind eases its scream to a moan. The waves, though still high, lose their breaking crests. The ship settles back into a more rhythmic, predictable roll. The storm has passed, and the flexible, lashed hull of the Nar has once again proven that in the North Atlantic, it is better to bend than to break. The violence of the storm has finally exhausted itself. The wind, which had been screaming through the rigging for hours, drops first to a moan, and then to a whisper. The chaotic, confused seas that battered the hull begin to organize themselves again. They settle into a long, rhythmic swell. It lifts the ship gently, then lowers it, like a chest rising and falling in deep sleep. After the deafening roar of the gale, the silence that follows is sudden. It is profound, feels heavy. The only sounds are the water dripping from the wool sail, the creak of the mast settling back into its step, and the soft, rhythmic wash of the Atlantic against the clinker-built strakes. The men, exhausted from the bailing and the terror, stop moving. They lie still in their leather sleeping bags, listening to the ship breathe. The hull, lashed together with those spruce roots we spoke of, relaxes. The tension leaves the wood, and then the clouds break. It begins as a small tear in the gray ceiling above. It reveals a patch of velvet blackness so deep, it looks like a hole in the universe. Slowly, the tear widens. The storm front rolls away to the east, taking its violence with it, and the sky is scrubbed clean. If you were lying on the deck of that Nar, looking up, you would see a display of stars more brilliant than any modern eye has likely ever witnessed. There is no light pollution here. There is no city glow on the horizon. There is only the absolute, crushing dark of the North Atlantic and the piercing fire of the cosmos. Leif Erikson moves to the stern. He is looking for one light in particular. He is looking for the Leidarstjarna. Now, in Old Norse, lei means way or course, and stjarna means star. The Leidarstjarna is the guiding star. We call it Polaris or the North Star. To the Norse navigator, this point of light was the anchor of the world. All the other stars dance. They rise in the east, they arc across the sky, and they set in the west. They are travelers, just like the Vikings. But the Leidarstjarna, it is steadfast. It sits almost motionless at the celestial pole, the pivot point around which the entire heavens seem to turn. Leif knows that as long as he can see the star, he cannot be truly lost. By measuring how high the star sits above the horizon, perhaps using nothing more than the width of his hand or a notched stick, he can estimate his latitude. He knows that back home, at Brattahlid in Greenland, the star sits at a specific height. Here, as they sail further south toward the lands Bjarni saw, the star sinks lower and lower toward the horizon behind them. It is a visual measurement of their distance from home. But tonight, looking at that solitary star emphasizes something else: their profound isolation. Consider the demographics of this voyage. We know from archaeological studies that the entire Norse population of Greenland at this time was likely no more than 400 or 500 people. Maybe a few thousand at its absolute peak, but right now, it's a tiny community. It was a fragile cluster of farms clinging to the edge of a massive island. And now, Leif and his crew of 35 are sailing away from even that small comfort. They are suspended in a void. To the north lies the ice. To the east, thousands of miles of open ocean separate them from Norway. To the west lies a coastline that is dark, silent, and utterly devoid of cities, lighthouses, or harbors. There is no one to rescue them. If the Nar fails, if those spruce roots snap, they vanish. They simply disappear from history. Yet, this isolation brings a kind of clarity. The air after the storm is scrubbed of salt spray. It is crisp. It is cold. The water, now calm, reflects the starlight, so the ship seems to be floating in space, suspended between the stars above and the stars below. And occasionally, the sky might offer another sign. In these high latitudes, even in the year 1000, the aurora borealis would frequently paint the dark with curtains of green and violet light. Recent scientific studies of tree rings from this era have revealed something fascinating. There were massive solar storms around the year 993 AD, events that flooded the atmosphere with high-energy particles. To the crew, seeing the night sky light up with shivering red and green fire might have been terrifying. Or it might have been seen as the Bifrost Bridge of their old gods. But to the navigator, it was just another part of the environment. Beautiful, but distracting from the steady, cold light of the Lidarstjarna. The fear of the storm fades into a deep, rhythmic fatigue. The ship is safe. The course is true. The guiding star is behind them, pushing them south, pushing them toward the warm air and the hardwoods of the land they seek. The crew sleeps, drifting in the silence of the Atlantic, carried by the current and the wind toward the new world. The Atlantic has released its grip. After the long days of gray horizons and the tension of the open ocean, the rhythm of the ship changes. We are no longer fighting the swells of the deep sea. We are riding a current that feels purposeful. It is pulling us toward a new reality. We have sailed south from the forest lands of Markland, following the coastline. And now, the air itself begins to tell a different story. If you were standing on the deck of the Nar in this moment, the first thing you would notice is the temperature. The biting, metallic chill of the Davis Strait and the glaciers of the north has softened. It is not tropical. We are still in the north, after all, but the wind has lost its teeth. It carries a scent that is distinct from the sterile ice of Greenland. It smells of peat. It smells of wet earth and of sedge grass warming in the sun. This is the breath of a living land. Ahead of the prow, the coastline resolves into a long, reaching finger of land. This is the tip of what we now know as the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland. To the Norse, navigating without charts, this landmass acted as a massive funnel. They have entered the Strait of Belle Isle. It is a channel of water where the currents are strong and complex, swirling in from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Leaf, standing at the steering or watches the water. He sees the change in color. He sees the way the deep ocean blue gives way to the lighter, sediment-rich turquoise of the shallows. He steers the ship toward a wide, shallow bay that opens up to the west. This is Epaves Bay. To the modern eye, the bay might look unremarkable, but to a Viking chieftain looking for a strategic foothold, it is perfect. It is open, offering clear views of any approaching ships or ice. Yet, it is protected by a scattering of islands, Great Sacred Island and the smaller, flat islands that break the force of the Atlantic swells. As the Nar glides into the bay, the crew falls silent. They crowd the rail. Their eyes are drinking in the color that defines this place. Green. Not the fleeting, desperate green of a Greenland summer, but a deep, lush, rolling green. The land here slopes gently up from a curving beach to a dry, grassy terrace bordered by peat bogs. It is a landscape that whispers of pasture. And for men and women whose wealth is measured in cattle and sheep, this site is more precious than gold. The ship slows. The wool sail loses its wind as they enter the shelter of the bay. But there is a catch. The water here is very shallow. Extensive sandbars guard the entrance. The sagas tell us that when they arrived, the tide was out, and the ship actually ran aground before they could reach the shore. They were so eager to get to the land that they jumped overboard and ran through the water. But let us imagine they have timed the tide correctly this time. They wait for the high water to lift the heavy oak keel over the shoals. They glide toward the mouth of a freshwater stream. This stream, which we now call Black Duck Brook, winds its way through the sedge bog and empties into the sea. It is the lifeline of the settlement to come. The water is clear, cold, and sweet. The anchor splashes down. It bites into the sandy bottom. The journey from Greenland, over 1,000 miles of open ocean, is over. They have arrived. As they wade ashore, pulling the small afterboat onto the dark sand, they are walking into history. Now, for a long time, the exact date of this arrival was a matter of estimation. It was a guess based on the style of their tools and the timeline of the stories. But recently, science has illuminated this moment with startling precision. In the year 993 AD, a massive solar storm erupted on the surface of the sun. It bombarded the Earth with cosmic rays. This event left a distinct chemical signature, a spike in radioactive carbon, in every living tree on the planet. By analyzing the wooden scraps left behind at this very site, specifically the outer rings of fir logs that were cut with metal axes, scientists have counted the rings outward from that solar storm signal. They found exactly 28 growth rings following the storm year. This tells us, with absolute certainty, that the Norse were here. They were felling trees and standing on this beach in the year 1021 AD. So we can place ourselves in that exact moment. It is 1021. The air is mild. The grass is tall. According to the saga, when they first came ashore, the crew found dew on the grass. They touched it with their fingers and brought it to their mouths, and they thought they had never tasted anything so sweet. It is a moment of sensory wonder. The salt of the sea voyage washed away by the sweet water of the new land. This site, Lons Meadows, corresponds closely to the place called Stromfur in the sagas. That means fjord of currants. It was not the Vinland of wild grapes. Those grew further south in the warmer hardwoods. But it was the gateway. It was the base camp. Look at the terrace where they will build. It is a narrow, curving ridge of dry land, sandwiched between the sea and the bog. It is an exposed spot, open to the wind. That wind is good. It keeps the biting insects at bay, and it offers a commanding view of the strait. It is a place chosen by sailors, for sailors. They begin to unload the ship. Out come the sea chests, the tools, the weapons, and out come the livestock. Imagine the cattle, stumbling a little on their sea legs as they are led off the ship. Their hooves sink into the soft sand of the beach. Then, they smell the grass. They lower their heads and begin to graze. To the Norse, this is the ultimate sign of success. In Greenland, keeping cattle alive through the winter was a brutal struggle. But here, the pasture is waiting. The crew sets up temporary tents, or booths, but soon they will begin the hard work of permanence. They will cut the turf from the bog. They will peel back the thick, fibrous mat of the earth to build the walls of their longhouses. They will fell the balsam fir and the spruce trees to frame their roofs. They are not just camping. They are building a station for the harvesting of a continent. The silence of the bay is broken by the sound of axes, the lowing of cattle, and the voices of men and women speaking Old Norse on the shores of North America. They have found the entry point. To the south lies the promise of timber and wine. To the north lies the ice. And here, in the green embrace of Epaves Bay, they drive their stakes into the ground. They are claiming the new world for themselves. The moment of arrival, it isn't just a single event. It isn't just a keel scraping against sand. It is a series of sensory shifts. It is the transition from the rolling, unstable world of the ocean to the static, unyielding reality of the earth. As the Nar pushes deeper into the shallows of Epaves Bay, the first sensation that hits the crew is sound, or rather, the lack of it. For weeks, for what feels like a lifetime, their ears have been filled with the roar of the North Atlantic. They have heard nothing but the screaming of the wind, the straining of the wool sail, and that relentless, chaotic wash of waves hammering against the hull. But now, as they glide into the shelter of the bay, the roar drops away. It is replaced by a silence that feels almost heavy. You hear the soft, rhythmic lapping of water against sand. You hear the call of seabirds, eider ducks and gulls, circling in the clear air. Leaf orders the sail lowered. The heavy, red woolen fabric collapses with a rustle. The ship loses its forward drive. It drifts on its own momentum, slowing, until it stops. Now, the sagas tell us something very human about this moment. They tell us the crew was impatient. Apparently, when they arrived, the tide was going out. There were extensive sandbars guarding the entrance, and the ship ran aground before they could actually reach the dry beach. A cautious captain might have waited. He might have sat there for 6 hours, waiting for the tide to turn and lift the ship off the sand. But these men, they had been confined in a wooden box for weeks. They were done waiting. The saga says they were so eager to get to the land that they jumped out of the boat and ran through the shallows. Imagine that moment of contact. You swing your legs over the gunwale of the ship. Your feet splash into the water. But it's not the freezing, life-sapping cold of the open ocean. It is the shallow, sun-warmed water of a protected inlet. Your boots sink into the sandy bottom. You wade toward the beach, the water dragging at your heavy wool trousers, until finally, you step onto dry land. And this is where the world feels strange. The ground does not move. After weeks of compensating for the pitch and roll of the ship, after weeks of your inner ear adjusting to the horizon constantly tilting, the stillness of the earth feels wrong, feels dizzying. Sailors call it land sickness. You stand there on the beach, but your body still feels like it's swaying. You are standing on a terrace of land, a narrow, curving ridge that separates the sea from a vast inland bog. And the air here is distinct. It does not smell of ice. It does not smell of salt spray. It smells of peat. Behind the beach lies a vast carpet of moss, sphagnum moss, and sedge peat bogs. It is an earthy, rich scent. It smells of damp soil, decaying plant matter, and the aromatic resin of the balsam fir and spruce trees that line the ridge. To a Greenlander, used to the sterile scent of glaciers and rock, this air smells like life. It is early morning. The sun is rising over the Atlantic, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. And it is here, right here on this beach, that the saga records one of the most beautiful and specific sensory details in all of medieval literature. The text says that the men went ashore and looked about them in the fine weather. They noticed that there was dew on the grass. One of them, perhaps Leif himself, reached down, He swept his rough, calloused fingers through the tall grass, collecting the moisture. He brought his wet fingers to his mouth, and the saga tells us, it seemed to them that they had never tasted anything so sweet. Now, pause and think about that. Was the dew actually sweet? Maybe. Some botanists think it might have been honeydew from aphids on the lime grass. But I think it was something else. I think it was the profound sweetness of fresh water. For weeks, these men have been rationing water from wooden casks. Water that has been sloshing around in a ship's hold, growing stale, tasting of old wood and algae, to taste fresh, cold dew, straight from the living earth. It must have felt like a baptism. It was the taste of survival. It was the taste of a land that wanted them to live. They walk further up the bank to the terrace where they will build their home. This spot, Lonseux Meadows, corresponds perfectly to the place described in the saga of Eric the Red as the Fjord of Currents. And indeed, the currents in the strait out there are strong and complex, swirling back and forth just as the story says. But the crew doesn't stay idle for long. They begin the hard work of unloading. They bring the livestock ashore. We have to remember the animals. The cattle and the sheep have been confined in the hold, standing in the dark, terrified by the storm, for the entire voyage. Imagine the animals stumbling onto the grass. Their legs are stiff. They are confused by the light. But then, they look down. The grass here is tall. It is lush. In Greenland, farmers have to fight for every single blade of hay to keep their animals alive through the winter. But here, the saga notes with absolute wonder that the livestock could graze outdoors all winter. Now, modern archaeology suggests the winters were a bit colder than that. But in the year 1021, during that warm climatic window, compared to the harshness of Greenland, this pastureland must have seemed miraculous. The cows lower their heads and begin to graze immediately. The crew sets up temporary shelters first. The saga calls them booths. These are simple structures. They build low walls of turf, but they roof them with tent cloth, just enough to keep the dew off while they sleep. But soon, they begin to build for permanence. They take their iron spades, and they strip the thick, fibrous turf from the bog. They layer it grass side down to build thick, insulating walls. They fell the local trees, the balsam fir and the black spruce, to frame the roofs. And we know for a fact that they were here in the year 1021 because of those trees. When archaeologists analyzed the wood chips left behind in the bog, they found that distinct radioactive signature from the solar storm of 993 AD. They counted the rings out, exactly 28 rings, to the bark. 1021 AD. The sounds of construction fill the air. The thud of iron axes against wood. The slice of turf cutters. The lowing of cattle. They are building a station that mirrors the great chieftains' halls of Iceland. They are building large, multi-room structures. Hall D, Hall F. These aren't just shacks. They are statements. As the sun sets on that first day, the men and women of the expedition stand on the ridge, looking out over the strait. They have fresh water. They have timber. They have iron in the bog. And they have the sweet taste of dew on their lips. They have crossed the open ocean and found a foothold on the edge of a new continent. They are no longer just sailors. They are now the first Europeans to call North America home. As the settlement of Leafsbutter settles into the rhythm of the seasons, a question lingers over the entire enterprise. It is a question that has puzzled historians for centuries. A debate fought over vowels and geography. The question is simple. Why did Leif Erikson call this place Vinland? For a long time, scholars argued over the name. You see, in Old Norse, the word Vin with a short I means pasture or meadow. Given the lush grasses surrounding the camp at Lonseux Meadows, and how happy those cows were, this seemed like a sensible name, a pragmatic name, pasture land. But there is another interpretation, one that leans into the romantic and the luxurious. If the word is spoken with a long, accented I, Vinland, it translates to wineland, and the history books are stubborn about this. The oldest written record we have regarding this place comes from a German cleric named Adam of Bremen. He was writing way back in 1075 AD, just a few decades after the voyages. He claimed that the Danish king told him of an island in the ocean where grapevines grow there by themselves, producing the best wine. The sagas, too, are insistent. They tell us of a crew member named Turker, Leif's foster father, wandering off into the woods and finding vines and grapes. He was so excited that he started speaking in his native German tongue. But here is the problem that fueled the skepticism for years. Wild grapes do not grow in Newfoundland. They do not grow at Lonseux Meadows. The climate is too cold. The winters are too long. Even in the warm period, it wasn't that warm. So, critics argued that the Wineland name was a lie, a marketing trick, just like Greenland, a fabrication to make the desolate north sound like the Mediterranean. But the peat bogs of Lonseux Meadows held a secret that would vindicate the sagas. During the excavations, deep within the layers of preserved organic matter, archaeologists found something that did not belong. They found 3 butternuts, also known as white walnuts. Now, these were not fossils from a distant geologic age. They were fresh nuts, harvested by human hands. Alongside them, excavators found a piece of wood, a burl from a butternut tree that had been sliced with a sharp metal knife. This discovery, this is the smoking gun of the Norse voyages. You see, the butternut tree is a picky species. It requires a specific climate, deep soils, and a long growing season. It does not grow in Newfoundland. In fact, it has never grown in Newfoundland. The nearest place where butternut trees grow wild is far to the south, in the St. Lawrence River Valley and northeastern New Brunswick. That is nearly 1,000 kilometers away. This tells us something profound about the Norse movements. It tells us that Lonseux Meadows was not their final destination. It was a gateway. It was a base camp, a fjord of currents, just as the saga said, a safe harbor from which they launched further expeditions south, deep into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And here is where the pieces fit together. The northern limit of the butternut tree corresponds almost perfectly with the northern limit of the wild riverbank grape, Vitis riparia. If the Vikings went far enough south to harvest walnuts, they went far enough south to find grapes. The sagas describe the crew cutting down grape trees to bring back to Greenland. Now, that phrasing, grape trees, often confused modern readers. Grapes grow on vines, not trees. But the riverbank grape of New Brunswick behaves differently than a vineyard grape in France. It is an aggressive climber. It winds itself around the trunks of hardwood trees, elm, oak, and maple, climbing high into the canopy to find the sun. To a Norseman standing on the forest floor, looking up, the tree would look as if it were producing the grapes itself. To harvest the fruit and to get that valuable hardwood timber simultaneously, they would simply fell the tree. So, Imagine the scene inside the Great Hall at Lons Meadows. It is late autumn. The expedition has returned from the south. The boat is heavy with a cargo that represents unimaginable luxury to a Greenlander. They have planks of hardwood, butternut, and ash, timber far superior to the soft driftwood of the north. They have sacks of nuts, rich in oil and protein, and they have grapes. Perhaps they tried to ferment them into wine, or perhaps they simply ate them as a sweet, bursting reminder that they had reached a land of plenty. You have to understand, wine was not just a drink to the Norse. It was a symbol of power. It was usually imported at great cost from the Rhineland for the tables of chieftains. To have a land that provided it wild, for free, that was a discovery of immense prestige. The controversy is settled by the humble butternut. The Norse did not lie. They sailed past the cold winds of Newfoundland, entering the warm estuaries of the south. They found the vines. They found the hardwoods. And for a brief moment, they held the resources of a new continent in their hands. As the settlement of leaf's butter settles into the rhythm of the seasons, a question lingers over the entire enterprise. It is a question that has puzzled historians for centuries, a debate fought over vowels and geography. The question is simple. Why did Leif Erikson call this place Vinland? For a long time, scholars argued over the name. You see, in Old Norse, the word vin with a short I means pasture or meadow. Given the lush grasses surrounding the camp at Lons Meadows, and how happy those cows were, this seemed like a sensible name, a pragmatic name, pasture land. But there is another interpretation, one that leans into the romantic and the luxurious. If the word is spoken with a long, accented I, Vinland, it translates to wineland, and the history books are stubborn about this. The oldest written record we have regarding this place comes from a German cleric named Adam of Bremen. He was writing way back in 1075 AD, just a few decades after the voyages. He claimed that the Danish king told him of an island in the ocean where grapevines grow there by themselves, producing the best wine. The sagas, too, are insistent. They tell us of a crew member named Turker, Leif's foster father, wandering off into the woods and finding vines and grapes. He was so excited that he started speaking in his native German tongue. But here is the problem that fueled the skepticism for years. Wild grapes do not grow in Newfoundland. They do not grow at Lons Meadows. The climate is too cold. The winters are too long. Even in the warm period, it wasn't that warm. So, critics argued that the Wineland name was a lie, a marketing trick, just like Greenland, a fabrication to make the desolate north sound like the Mediterranean. But the peat bogs of Lons Meadows held a secret that would vindicate the sagas. During the excavations, deep within the layers of preserved organic matter, archaeologists found something that did not belong. They found 3 butternuts, also known as white walnuts. Now, these were not fossils from a distant geologic age. They were fresh nuts, harvested by human hands. Alongside them, excavators found a piece of wood, a burl from a butternut tree that had been sliced with a sharp metal knife. This discovery, this is the smoking gun of the Norse voyages. You see, the butternut tree is a picky species. It requires a specific climate, deep soils, and a long growing season. It does not grow in Newfoundland. In fact, it has never grown in Newfoundland. The nearest place where butternut trees grow wild is far to the south, in the St. Lawrence River Valley and northeastern New Brunswick. That is nearly 1,000 kilometers away. This tells us something profound about the Norse movements. It tells us that L'Anse aux Meadows was not their final destination. It was a gateway, it was a base camp, a fjord of currents, just as the saga said, a safe harbor from which they launched further expeditions south, deep into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And here is where the pieces fit together. The northern limit of the butternut tree corresponds almost perfectly with the northern limit of the wild riverbank grape, Vitis riparia. If the Vikings went far enough south to harvest walnuts, they went far enough south to find grapes. The sagas describe the crew cutting down grape trees to bring back to Greenland. Now, that phrasing, grape trees, often confused modern readers. Grapes grow on vines, not trees. But the riverbank grape of New Brunswick behaves differently than a vineyard grape in France. It is an aggressive climber. It winds itself around the trunks of hardwood trees, elm, oak, and maple, climbing high into the canopy to find the sun. To a Norseman standing on the forest floor, looking up, the tree would look as if it were producing the grapes itself. To harvest the fruit and to get that valuable hardwood timber simultaneously, they would simply fell the tree. So, imagine the scene inside the great hall at L'Anse aux Meadows. It is late autumn. The expedition has returned from the south. The boat is heavy with a cargo that represents unimaginable luxury to a Greenlander. They have planks of hardwood, butternut, and ash, timber far superior to the soft driftwood of the north. They have sacks of nuts, rich in oil and protein. And they have grapes. Perhaps they tried to ferment them into wine, or perhaps they simply ate them as a sweet, bursting reminder that they had reached a land of plenty. You have to understand, wine was not just a drink to the Norse. It was a symbol of power. It was usually imported at great cost from the Rhineland for the tables of chieftains. To have a land that provided it wild, for free, that was a discovery of immense prestige. The controversy is settled by the humble butternut. The Norse did not lie. They sailed past the cold winds of Newfoundland, entering the warm estuaries of the south. They found the vines, they found the hardwoods, and for a brief moment, they held the resources of a new continent in their hands. Let us walk away from the main halls now. We cross the small, cold stream known as Black Duck Brook, moving away from the living quarters to a small, solitary hut dug into the riverbank. It stands apart from the rest of the settlement, and for good reason. This is the place of fire, smoke, and noise. This is the smithy. Now, to the modern mind, the word industry usually implies massive factories. We think of towering smokestacks and assembly lines. But here, on the edge of the 11th century, industry is intimate. It is elemental. It begins not in a mine deep underground, but in the wet, spongy earth of the bog itself. The Norse did not have to dig shafts into the mountains to find their metal. They relied on bog iron. If you were to walk through the wetlands surrounding the camp today, you might notice an oily, rainbow-colored sheen on the water, or reddish-brown sludge accumulating around the roots of the sedge grass. This is iron. It is dissolved from the bedrock by the groundwater, and then precipitated out by bacteria living in the peat. To the untrained eye, it looks like rusty mud, but to a Viking smith, it is the raw material of survival. The process of turning this mud into metal is a feat of chemical engineering. First, the crew had to harvest the bog, or they cut the sod and gathered the pea-sized nodules of iron. Then, they had to roast it on open fires. This dried it out and removed the impurities. Inside the small furnace hut, identified by archaeologists as Hut J, we find the remains of the technology that made this transformation possible. Excavators found a small furnace built of stone slabs set on edge, chinked with clay to make it airtight. Imagine the scene inside this hut. It is dark. It is illuminated only by the angry red glow of the vent hole. The air is thick, acrid, choking with the smell of burning charcoal. The smith and his assistants are feeding the furnace. They are alternating layers of roasted bog ore and charcoal produced in a pit kiln just outside. To melt the rock and release the iron, the furnace needs to reach a temperature of at least 1,100 degrees Celsius. 1,100 degrees. To achieve this heat without modern machinery required human lungs and mechanical rhythm. A double-chambered bellows would have been inserted into the front of the furnace, pumped steadily for hours, forcing oxygen into the heart of the fire. The result of this intense labor was a bloom, a spongy, glowing mass of iron and slag. The smith would then have to take this red-hot lump to the anvil, likely a large, flat stone found in the hut, and hammer it repeatedly, beating the impurities out of the metal. When archaeologists sifted through the floor of this hut, they found the waste product of this process. Schloch. They found mounds of it, heavy, black, glass-like waste that proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that iron smelting had occurred here. This slag is historic. It represents the first time in the history of the New World that human beings smelted metal from ore. While indigenous peoples like the Dorset had masterfully cold-hammered meteoric iron and copper, the Norse were the first to use intense heat to chemically separate metal from stone on this continent. And what did they make with this precious, labor-intensive metal? They did not make swords for conquering. They did not make helmets for war. The fragments found in the smithy tell a more pragmatic story. They made nails. Specifically, they made boat nails and rivets. We must remember the Nar waiting in the bay. A Viking ship is held together by hundreds of iron rivets. But iron rusts. Salt water eats away at the metal. A rusted nail can snap in a storm. A loose plank can lead to a leak, and a leak in the North Atlantic is fatal. Archaeologists found nearly 100 nail fragments at the site. Many of them had been cut with a chisel. This is evidence that the crew was pulling old, rusted nails out of their ships and forging new ones to replace them. This small, smoky hut was not a weapons factory. It was a service station. It was the maintenance bay that ensured their only way home remained seaworthy. The amount of iron produced here was small. Estimates suggest a single smelt, producing perhaps enough iron for 100 to 200 nails. But the existence of the smithy proves that the Vinland voyagers were not just visiting. They were bringing the full technological suite of the Iron Age with them. They were turning the mud of Newfoundland into the rivets that held their world together. We must now turn our gaze from the iron of the smithy and the timber of the forest to the most significant discovery of all. For a long time, the Norse may have felt they were alone in this new world, wrestling only with the wind, the distance, and the winter, but they were not alone. They had entered a land that was already named, already known, and already owned. To the north, in the stone lands of Helluland, they likely saw the distant campfires of the Dorset people, the Paleo-Eskimos who carved delicate polar bears from ivory. But it was here in the south, in the hardwood forests of Vinland, perhaps in the Miramichi Bay of New Brunswick or the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that the silence was truly broken. The history describes the moment with cinematic clarity. The Norse were staying at their southern camp, a place they called Hop, which means a tidal lagoon. One morning, they looked out at the water and saw something startling. A fleet of small boats appeared. They were so numerous that the records say it looked as if charcoal had been scattered across the bay. These were skin boats, or perhaps birch bark canoes, propelled by men waving staves or paddles, and the Norse noted a peculiar sound. The paddles made a swishing noise, described as sounding like flails threshing grain. This is the moment of first contact. It is the first recorded meeting between the people of Europe and the indigenous peoples of North America. The Norse called these people Skraelings. Now, it is a harsh word. In Old Norse, it roughly translates to wretched ones or puny ones. It reflects the Norsemen's suspicion of the other. To the Vikings, who valued physical bulk and heavy iron weaponry, these lithe hunters in their light, agile boats seemed alien. Based on the geography, these were likely the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, or the Beothuk people. Despite the name-calling, the initial instinct was not war. It was curiosity. The indigenous men waved their staves in a sunwise motion, clockwise. The Norse interpreters read this as a sign of peace. So, a white shield was raised, the signal for a truce, and trade began. Imagine the scene on that sandy beach. Two groups of humans, separated by thousands of years of migration and an ocean of cultural difference, standing face to face. The language barrier was absolute. They had to speak with their hands and their eyes. The indigenous traders brought packs of gray furs, sable, and all manner of valuable pelts. Soft, warm wealth that the Norse coveted for the markets of Europe. In return, the indigenous men wanted weapons. They touched the iron swords and the spears, fascinated by the gray metal that could cut with so easily. But the Norse leader, a prudent man named Karlsefni, forbade it. He would not arm a potential enemy. Instead, the Norse offered something else. Red cloth. They cut their bolts of red woolen cloth, likely brought from the looms of Iceland or Greenland, into strips. The indigenous traders were captivated by the color. To them, the red strips were a treasure. They wrapped the cloth around their heads like bands. There is a fascinating detail about economic inflation here. As the trading continued, the Norse began to run low on cloth. So, they started cutting the strips narrower and narrower, until they were no wider than a finger. Yet, the history notes, the traders would give just as much fur or even more for these tiny scraps of red wool. There is another detail that adds a sensory layer to this meeting. We are told that the Norse women brought out buckets of milk or milk porridge. The indigenous people, who had no dairy animals and likely had never tasted cow's milk, were delighted by it. The text wryly notes that the traders carried their purchases away in their stomachs, while the Norse kept the furs. For a brief time, there was a fragile balance, a relationship built on curiosity and mutual benefit. But it was brittle, and it was destroyed, not by a grand act of betrayal, but by a strange accident. You see, Karlsefni had brought a bull with him from Greenland. He intended to use it for breeding cattle. One day, during a trading session, the bull burst out of the woods and let out a tremendous, bellowing roar. Now, while the indigenous people certainly knew of the bison, this animal was different. It was aggressive, unpredictable, and it was screaming in the middle of a trade meeting. The saga tells us they were terrified by the sudden violence of the beast. They ran to their boats and paddled away. They did not return for 3 weeks. When they did return, the mood had shifted. The paddles were no longer waving sunwise. They were waving counter-sunwise. The shrieking was no longer curious. It was a war cry. The ensuing battle was chaotic. The Norse, confident in their iron axes and swords, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of the warriors and their projectile tactics. There is a description of a weapon that terrified the Norse. A large blue-black sphere raised on a pole and hurled into the Norse ranks. It made a terrifying noise when it landed. Historians still debate what this was. Perhaps a harpoon bladder used as a noisemaker to intimidate, or a specific weapon known to some Algonquin groups. Whatever it was, it broke the Norse morale. They realized a terrifying truth. Their iron weapons made them individually superior, but they were a tiny island of humanity in a sea of people who knew the land. People who could move fast in their skin boats, and who were now hostile. The Norse retreated. They realized, as the history mournfully concludes, that, although the land was excellent, they could never live there in safety or freedom from fear. This realization marked the psychological end of the Vinland experiment. They could harvest the timber, they could pick the grapes, but they could not stay. The red cloth had been bartered, the milk had been drunk, and the bull had bellowed. The bridge between the continents, briefly opened by trade, was closing again, leaving the Norse to pack their ships and look back one last time at the forests they could not hold. So, the decision is made. The dream of a permanent settlement, of a new Norse kingdom in the west, is over. The reality of the Skraelings, the indigenous people who know this land far better than the Vikings ever could, has shattered the illusion of safety. But they are not going to leave empty-handed. Leif Erikson is a practical man. He is a merchant at heart. He knows that he cannot go back to his father, Eric the Red, with nothing but stories of a failed colony. He needs to bring back wealth. And so, the final season in Vinland becomes a season of harvest. Now, imagine the winter that follows. For a Greenlander, winter is usually a terrifying word. It means darkness. It means digging tunnels through the snow to get to the barn. It means rationing the hay and listening to the wind scream for months on end. But here, at the base camp in Lonseux Meadows, or perhaps further south at the Hop, the winter is strange. It is mild. The sagas tell us, with a tone of almost disbelief, that no snow fell and the livestock were able to graze outdoors for the entire season. Now, climatologists today think that might be a slight exaggeration. There was probably some snow, but compared to the brutal freeze of Greenland, it felt tropical. The cattle, the bull that had caused so much trouble, they grew fat on the standing grass. They didn't need to be kept in the dark, stinking barns. But the crew, they didn't rest. The sound of the winter was the sound of axes. Day after day, from dawn until the early sunset, the men were in the woods. They were felling the grape trees, those hardwoods draped in vines. They were hewing the timber into planks. You have to understand the value of this cargo. In Greenland, a single plank of oak or ash was worth a fortune. It meant a new loom for a weaver, a new keel for a boat, or a sturdy roof beam. They stripped the branches. They stacked the wood to season it, drying out the sap so it would be lighter to carry. And then there were the grapes. The saga gives us a very specific and slightly odd detail here. It says that Leif ordered the ship's afterboat, that small towboat they used for landing, to be filled with dried grapes. heaps of them, and the main hull of the Nar, that was filled with timber. So picture the ship now. It is no longer the light, cork-like vessel that skipped over the waves on the way out. It is heavy, sits deep in the water. The Plimsoll line is buried. It is a floating warehouse. As the spring melt arrives, and the ice begins to break up in the strait, the mood in the camp shifts. They are packing up. They strip the valuable items from the longhouses, the iron tools, the loom weights, the personal chests. They leave the sod walls standing, silent green monuments on the beach. They leave the heavy stones of the fireplaces. And, as we know from archaeology, they leave behind a few things they lost: a bronze pin, a spindle whorl, a few rivets, small, silent crumbs of history that would wait 1,000 years to be found. The day of departure arrives. The wind is blowing from the west, a fair wind. The crew pushes the heavy, laden ship out into the deeper water of Epaves Bay. They hoist the wool sail, and as the canvas catches the wind and the ship begins to surge forward, there must have been a complicated feeling in their chests. Relief? Yes. They were going home. They were leaving the fear of the arrows and the war cries behind. But also regret. They were looking back at a land that had everything they needed: timber, iron, pastures, grapes. It was a paradise for a Norse farmer, but it was a paradise with a gate they could not force open. The return journey is fast. The prevailing westerlies of the North Atlantic push them home. They retrace their steps, past the white sands of the Wonderstrands, past the dark forests of Markland, past the gray stone slabs of Helluland, and finally, the glaciers of Greenland rise from the sea. When Leif sails into Eriksfjord, toward the estate of Brattahlid, he is not just returning as a son. He is returning as a hero. The ship is so heavy with timber and wine that it probably looks like a miracle to the people on the shore. He unloads the logs, black spruce, balsam fir, maybe even some butternut. The smell of the fresh wood fills the air of the settlement. He unloads the dried grapes, which are turned into wine or eaten as sweet treats during the long winter nights. And he unloads the furs, the sable and the marten skins he traded for red cloth. It is a fortune. The saga tells us that after this voyage, Leif was no longer just Leif Erikson. He was given a new name, Leif Herhepni, Leif the Lucky. He had found the land. He had harvested its wealth. And, perhaps most importantly, he had survived to bring it home. But Leif himself, he would never go back. His father, Eric, would die soon after, and Leif would become the chieftain of Greenland. His duty was now to the colony, to govern, to adjudicate, to lead. He would never again stand on the white sands of the Wonderstrands or taste the dew on the grass of Vinland. But the door wasn't closed completely. Not yet. Others would try. Leif's brothers, his sister. They would look at that pile of timber, and they would look at the map, and they would think, I can do better. But for now, the ship is unloaded. The wood is stacked. The wine is poured. And the story of the discovery begins to turn into a legend. Leif Erikson's voyage was the breakthrough. He was the one who cracked the door open. He brought back the proof, the timber, the grapes, the wealth. But as the heavy oak doors of the chieftain's hall in Greenland closed behind him, the story did not end. You see, history often focuses on the first. We remember the person who cuts the ribbon. But the real story of the Vinland voyages, the human story, happened in the years after Leif. Leif himself would never return to the New World. He had a colony to run, but his family, they were restless. They looked at the maps he drew, or rather the stories he told, and they saw unfinished business. So other ships were prepared. Leif's brother, Thorvald, sailed. He wanted to explore the danger that Leif had avoided. And later, a wealthy merchant named Karlsefni, along with Leif's sister, prepared for something much more ambitious than a logging trip. They were not just going to harvest. They were going to stay. How do we know this? How do we know they weren't just rough men looking for a fight or a quick fortune? Well, we know it because of a small gray stone. If you were to visit the museum in Newfoundland today, you might walk right past it. It isn't gold. It isn't a sword. It sits quietly in a glass case, looking like a discarded pebble or a bead. It is a spindle whorl. It was found during the excavations at L'Anse aux Meadows, buried in the peat near one of the great halls. Now, to understand the explosive significance of this tiny stone, you have to understand the gender roles of the Viking Age. In the world of 1000 AD, labor was strictly divided. Men fought, they felled trees, they forged iron, they sailed the ships. Women ran the farms, they managed the food, and, crucially, they made the cloth. Spinning wool was the universal work of Norse women. It was a constant, rhythmic part of their existence. To spin wool into yarn, they used a wooden drop spindle, a stick with a weight at the bottom to keep it spinning. Like a flywheel, that weight is the whorl. Finding a spindle whorl at L'Anse aux Meadows is the archaeological equivalent of finding a signature. Proves without a doubt that women were there. And this changes everything. If there were women, it means there were families. It means there was domestic life. Men on a raiding party or a logging expedition do not bring their wives. They do not bring spindles. They only bring women if they intend to build a home. The discovery of this stone fragment, carved from soapstone, allows us to reconstruct a scene that is far more intimate than the storms and the battles we have talked about. Close your eyes and picture the great hall at L'Anse aux Meadows again. It is evening. The wind is howling outside, battering the thick sod walls. The men are repairing their tools or sharpening their axes. But in the corner, near the warmth of the long fire, sits a woman. Perhaps it is Gudrid. Gudrid is one of the most fascinating figures in the sagas. She was a traveler, a survivor, and she was there. She sits on the bench, her fingers moving rhythmically. She flicks the wooden spindle and the stone whorl spins. Were twisting the raw wool into strong yarn. She is making the thread that will mend the men's tunics. She is making the yarn that will be woven into the sails that carry them home. This sound, the hum of the spindle, is the sound of permanence. It is the sound of civilization taking root. And with the women came the children. The sagas tell us that during the few years the Norse tried to live in Vinland, Gudrid gave birth. His name was Snorri, Snorri Thorfinnsson. He was born there, in the sod longhouse, wrapped in furs, breathing the air of the New World. He was the first European child born in North America. Just imagine that. A Viking baby crawling on the floor of a house in Newfoundland, 500 years before Columbus set sail. His birth meant that Vinland was no longer just a resource station. It was a birthplace. It was a home. But, as we know, it was a home that could not last. The spindle whorl was eventually dropped. Perhaps it broke, or was lost in the rush to pack. The pressure from the indigenous people, the Skraelings, was too great. The distance from the iron supplies of Greenland was too far. The economics just didn't work. Karlsefni, Gudrid, and little Snorri packed their belongings. They loaded the timber, they rounded up the cattle, and they left. They left the sod houses standing. They left the furnace hut cold. They left the butternut shells scattered on the floor. And they left the spindle whorl in the dirt. When the ships sailed out of Epaves Bay for the last time, silence returned to the terrace. The grass continued to grow on the roofs of the longhouses until the buildings looked just like natural hills. The timber frames rotted and collapsed. The iron nails rusted into the earth. The indigenous people, the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, surely visited the site. They might have camped there, wondering about the strange, square mounds and the people who had come from the sea with their red cloth and their bellowing cattle. But eventually, the moss took over. The peat bog encroached. The memory of the voyage faded into legend. In Europe, the story of Vinland became a rumor, a tall tale told by Icelanders. Most people didn't believe it. A land of vines and self-sown wheat across the ocean? It sounded like a fairy tale. For nearly 1,000 years, the only proof that it happened lay in the old, crumbling pages of the sheepskin manuscripts, the sagas. And it lay in the ground, waiting for a Norwegian husband and wife to come looking for it. And so, the ships sailed away. The sod roofs collapsed. The moss grew back over the scars in the earth. For 9 centuries, the wind blew over the terrace at Lonseux Meadows. The story of the wineland retreated into the shadows. It became a campfire story in Iceland, a few lines of ink on sheepskin parchment. To the rest of the world, it was a myth. Serious historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries dismissed it. They said, sure, maybe they sailed a bit, but a settlement in North America? Impossible. They thought the sagas were just folklore, like dragons or trolls. But the earth remembers. In the year 1960, a man appeared on the coast of Newfoundland. His name was Helge Ingstad. Now, Helge wasn't just a desk-bound academic. He was a Norwegian adventurer, a man who had been a trapper in the Arctic. He looked at the map with a sailor's eye, not a library's eye. He was convinced that if you followed the sailing directions in the sagas literally, they wouldn't lead you to New England or New York, as many people thought. They would lead you here, to the northern tip of Newfoundland. But he didn't find it alone. He found it because he did something very simple. He asked the locals. He sailed into the small fishing village of Lonseux Meadows and asked a local resident named George Decker a simple question. Are there any old ruins around here? And George casually said, yes, follow me. He led Helge up from the beach to the grassy terrace. He pointed to some faint, overgrown outlines in the ground. The locals called them the Old Indian Camp. But when Helge looked, he didn't see the circular rings of wigwams. He saw squares. He saw rectangles. He called his wife, and Stein Ingstad. Now, and Stein was the scientist. She was a brilliant archaeologist. And for the next 8 years, she peeled back the layers of turf with a trowel. She found the soot from the long fire. She found the iron rivets from the ships. She found the spindle whorl Gudrid had dropped. She proved conclusively that the fairy tale was real. But there was still one nagging question. When carbon dating in the 1960s was a blunt instrument, it gave a range. It told us the Vikings were there sometime around the year 1000. Maybe 990? Maybe 1050? It was a blurry window. For 60 years, we had to settle for circa 1000 AD. But then, in the year 2021, the sun spoke to us. A team of scientists published a study in the journal Nature that changed everything. And they did it using a cosmic clock. You see, they knew that in the year 993 AD, a massive solar storm exploded from the surface of the sun. It was a violent event that bombarded the Earth with high-energy cosmic rays. This radiation didn't hurt anyone, but it left a mark. It caused a massive one-year spike in a radioactive isotope called carbon-14. Every tree alive on planet Earth in the year 993 absorbed that spike. It was locked into that specific growth ring, a chemical timestamp. So, the scientists went back to the wood scraps found at Lons Meadows. They took pieces of fir and juniper that had been cut by Viking axes. They looked at the rings under a microscope, and they found it. They found the 993 ring, the one glowing with that extra solar radiation. And then they just started counting. They counted the rings outward from that storm. 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. In every single sample, they counted exactly 28 rings from the storm to the bark, the waney edge, where the tree had been cut down. The math was simple, beautifully simple. 993 plus 28, 1021 AD. Suddenly, the fog of history vanished. We weren't guessing anymore. We knew with absolute scientific certainty that in the autumn of the year 1021, a Norseman stood in that forest. He swung an iron axe. He felt the vibration in his hands as the blade bit into the wood, and he felled that tree to build a home in the New World. It proves that exactly 471 years before Christopher Columbus stumbled onto the Caribbean islands, European ships were already crossing the Atlantic. They were building, they were trading, they were living here, and so we end our journey where we began. We started with a hunger for land and wood. We sailed through the ice. We survived the storms. We tasted the sweet dew of the new grass. The Vinland colony eventually failed. The distance was too great. The resistance too strong. The Norse pulled back to Greenland, and then eventually they vanished from there too. But for a brief, shining moment, the Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier. It was a bridge, and the echoes of those iron axes, ringing out in the cold, clear air of 1021, still resonate today, proving that the history of this continent is deeper, older, and far more complex than we ever imagined. Thank you for taking this voyage with me. If you enjoyed drifting back to the year 1000, and if you want to hear more stories from the edge of history, please take a second to click that subscribe button and hit the like button to let us know you're listening. Sleep well and keep looking west.